Hey everyone, we'll just give about 5 more minutes to get started. For everybody that's joined, welcome. Hi Monica, I see that you're on.
Hello. I like the music, turn it up.
Yeah, just casually in the background, right?
I like
Get everybody
it.
pumped.
Yep, so we'll start at 3:15. Your audio and video looks good, and so you're good to go.
Awesome, sounds good.
All right, and I'll hop off and I'll be here if you need me.
Sounds good, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Happy Thursday. I see a couple more people tuning in. We'll get started here at the 3:15 mark. Hopefully you guys are enjoying the jams here. Gotta turn it up. Not loud enough? There we go. Hey, Vonda. Thank you. I enjoyed everybody's session so far today. It's been a good event. We got about 1 more minute here before we get started. Yes, agreed. Yeah, I thought there's been a lot of good nuggets of information throughout the conference. It's been awesome. Alrighty, we're coming close to the mark here. Let me turn down my dance music here. So we got about 10 seconds. I'll go ahead and get started right on the 15 mark. Hey, so yeah, excited for it. Awesome. Okay, we're at the 15 mark. I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here on the talk on designing systems to achieve your goals. My name is Juan Chavez. I'm a lead UI engineer at Apple. I'm also a part-time entrepreneur, helping manage 2 small businesses. So I'm actually the youngest of 3. Those are my parents and my siblings. Fun fact about myself is I co-own a small business with my brother called Miotis, where we design custom apparel. And I also co-own another business with my mother, my father, and myself called Del Rio, where we serve and cater delicious Mexican cuisine. So I feel like that's kind of where I get my work ethic from, is from my family. So I had a somewhat traditional path to software engineering. As an undergrad in college at Creighton, I had an internship with Hayneedle as a web developer. And then after graduating with a computer science degree from Creighton, I went to work for General Electric as a full stack software engineer. And I actually believe I have my computer science professor on the call. So if you're on the call, quick shout out to Dr. Dave Reed. All right. The final 3 years, I've been working with Apple on some projects, designing user interfaces, APIs, conversational technologies. And now I'm thinking more of kind of a lead role on those different projects. And over those last 6 years, while kind of learning and balancing more, the difficulty of kind of meeting my own personal and career goals increased. So things started off fine and dandy. I was tackling tickets, I was cranking out code, and kind of as more responsibility came my way and on my plate, things started to look a bit more hectic and crazy. Felt like every day was putting out a fire. So even including today. So it hasn't really changed much. But what this talk is mostly about is us tech professionals and software engineers, being asked to do more and more between front-end development, back-end development, database management, DevOps, monitoring, hosting, design, project management methodologies, and new tools and frameworks get added to our belt every year. So with the high demand for new skills and knowledge in our professional lives, it makes work-life balance even harder. So burnout is pretty common among us tech professionals. A study conducted by the Blind Workforce Insight, it found that 57% of technology workers suffer from burnout. So that would be about over half of us on this conference in general. So in this breakout session, we'll be exploring how we could use the methodologies and learnings of creating and deploying technical projects and apply it to our own personal and career goals. And the objective here is to enrich our lives as tech professionals, avoid burnout, and enjoy our lives in and outside of work. So what I want to do today is take you guys along the journey of the systems that I've been using to manage my own personal and professional goals, and hopefully that you guys will also receive some insight from that. And we're going to use familiar strategies that are typically used for designing technical products. So these 7 steps I'll illustrate here are similar to what you would see in a kind of typical project management, software development, system design life cycles. So the steps are, number 1 is the ideation stage. That's really where we're just transferring our goals from our brain down to paper. Number 2 is the requirement stage. That's where we're trying to figure out all the inputs and outputs of our goals. Number 3 is the prototyping phase. That's where we're researching our goals and experimenting with different methods. Number 4 is the planning phase. That's where we'll be setting some action items for ourselves and doing all the planning necessary. Step 5 is the execution stage. And that's where we'll be actually executing all those action items in order to meet our goal. Step number 6 is monitor and manage. This is just determining if we're in the right direction, if we're on path to meet our target. And then step number 7 is the wrap-up stage. That one's pretty self-explanatory. The first 3 there, the ideation, requirements, and prototyping, in those stages, really asking ourselves, how can we better think through our goals that are usually just kind of floating around in our head and get them more well-defined? In the planning and execution stages, we'll be focused on setting up systems to kind of help us reach our goals. And the last 2 steps, monitor, manage, and wrap up, we're focused on staying motivated and keeping us moving towards our goals and closing things out once we've actually reached our set goal. A couple of things before we dive in. I'm hoping you guys get the most out of this presentation. So if you can have a paper and pen handy, if you don't already. I'll be also asking for, some of your opinions and engagement on the chat feature. So I'd really appreciate it if you guys can show me some love there by, being active and participating. We can just start by adding an emoji to the chat. You can start sending that through. It can be either a thumbs up, a smiling face, or maybe it's a cup of coffee if that's what you need this Thursday afternoon. But let's hop into it. So step number 1 is the ideation stage. So quick question for you guys. How many of you have set some New Year goals this year? So maybe it was late December, early January, you had some goals set. Maybe you wrote down a list or so. And then a follow-up question on that, if you guys are already seeing where I'm going here, is how many of you remember the last time that you reviewed these goals and actually looked at them, reflected on them, and kept up with them? And this is great because I know most of us here, we're all pretty productive people and pretty sharp. So we have these goals set, but we know once February and March come rolling around, some of us, forget half of our plans that we already set for ourselves. And yeah, it's a pretty common thing. I know myself, I'm guilty of it, but it's just to illustrate, why is it that we set these goals and then oftentimes just mindlessly forget about them? It may be because we never actually captured these goals. Maybe they were just thoughts in our head and we didn't capture them on paper or digitally. Or maybe we did capture them, but we never actually followed up on them. And we got lost in kind of the endless tasks of other things that we have to do. And maybe we just used our favorite excuse as tech professionals is, I just don't have the time. I know that's a pretty common one. So while that may or may not be true, which we'll come back to a bit later, the first step is really just defining our goals. It's to capture them as ideas that are floating around in our head and either store them with ink or with bits. So tip number 1 in the ideation phase, pretty straightforward, is just to write stuff down in notes on paper. If we don't capture it, it's really hard to go back to and review. So sometimes the best thing to do is to sit down for 20 minutes in solitude, if at all possible. I know some of us are working from home, so that it may be difficult to find a couple, 20-minute slot somewhere of just isolation. But our objective here is just to pour out any of our goals and aspirations from our brain down to a place that we can refer back to later on. Another strategy they can use here is mind maps to start connecting things that make sense. Once you've kind of done this brain dump, things are on paper, you can start visualizing and organizing your goals. You can definitely use more than just one sheet of paper. You can also use whiteboards just to get everything out there and start connecting dots. You can write really small if you only have a small sheet of paper, but one piece of advice is, try not to focus too much on grouping and categorizing things in the beginning. Just do a brain dump and then after start labeling and categorizing things. So some general ideas of things that you would want to capture for your goals. They could be around your passions. It can be your health. Maybe it's the time you spend with your family, your friends. Maybe it's your curiosity or your creativity or your investments, a bucket list, or maybe it's your donation of time and resources. It also doesn't have to be personal. It can be professional goals such as, improve my team's morale and happiness, or write better and clearer documentations for our processes and features. So in this phase, don't feel too strained by time or complexity. Just simply transfer the data from your head over to an external storage, which is a piece of paper or some digital notes. But this is the part where I want you guys to engage in. I'd really like if we all did this together. So if we can take about 2 minutes, I'm just gonna play some music here, but our goal here is just to do that brain dump activity. If you got a pen and paper, I encourage you guys to use that instead of a laptop or computer, just so that we're not distracted by any emails or texts or notifications, because we really just want to focus our efforts to capture as much as we can. And maybe, some of you guys will be trying to remember some of the goals that you set at the beginning of the year and actually start and capture those and write those down. But what you really want to do is just reflect on what's important to you. Where do you want to spend your time? What kind of things do you want to do more of? What kind of experiences do you want to get out of life? And what do you care about the most? Again, try not to constrain yourself too much. In this exercise, it'll just be for 2 minutes. I am gonna start a timer now, along with some funky music in the background for us, and then we'll check in about the 2-minute mark. That sounds good. And I'll also be joining you guys in doing this activity as well. All right, coming around the 2-minute mark, so we'll put a pause here. Maybe if you're capturing some of your last couple of thoughts and goals, get those down, and feel free to continue. If you're in the flow, continue writing stuff down. We'll kind of keep moving through the presentation, but we'll come back to those goals later. So definitely, have them near and by. I'll share some of the stuff that I wrote down. Some of the stuff I have here is, spending more time with my parents, drawing and painting more, and learning to cook healthier meals. Those are, kind of the stuff that I want to start focusing on the rest of the year. But you can definitely share some stuff you wrote down in the comments below as well. But we're going to keep chugging along here just to make sure we're making it with time. So what we did here, we did a brain dump. Now we can start categorizing this information. So tip number 2 here is to start label and categorizing those ideas. Are they professional or personal goals? Is it health related? Is it maybe a long-term or a short-term or a medium-term goal? How much do you actually care about that goal? How much of an impact does it have? This will group our goals and define them even further. So don't worry about labeling everything. The point here is just to add attributes to the goals that we're setting. So at this point, we can start looking to moving these items over to an online document, or maybe just reorganizing them on paper. But the objective isn't really just to do everything that you wrote down, but just to get an idea of what you want to be working towards. So there's a strategy that's commonly attributed to our very own Warren Buffett called the 5-25 rule, where you write down the top 25 things you like and want to work on and do, and then you circle the top 5 that's on that list, and then the step after that is just to scratch out the rest and completely forget about it. I know it's maybe a little extreme for some, because some of us do have a lot of goals we're trying to achieve, but the point here is that we just want to focus on those top 3 to 5 things. So if I were to ask you hypothetically, what are your top 5 goals right now? Would you be able to tell me, and would you be able to, bring those out right away? If not, then maybe this exercise is something that you could do just to bring more focus to your goals. So we only have a limited amount of time in the day, so narrowing down what's important to you would definitely bring you a lot more ease, especially if you're somebody who's, trying to be a high achiever, trying to get a lot of things done. Tip number 3 in this phase is do an analysis on your, hour by hour activities. There's a common time tracking experiment you can do, and I highly encourage you to try it if you haven't. You just pick a pretty average day in a, fairly manageable week, and you set an alarm for every 30 minutes. And when that alarm goes off, you just jot down what you've done in those past 30 minutes. So it can be, side projects. Maybe it's paid work, so you're doing your work. Maybe it's journaling or reading. Maybe it's spending time with friends, watching TV, going out, volunteering. You just really want to start defining where your time is going. And if you do this, maybe a couple days, you start to realize, okay, maybe I'm spending too much time here and not enough time there. And then that excuse of, I don't have time, although it could be a true statement, it's only true because you choose to do something else with that time that's more important to you than that specific thing. Some of the things you can do here is, you can use some browser extensions and apps to see what apps you're spending the most time on. You can also use your smartphone. There's a lot of them have screen time or the equivalent to see, what applications that you're just on the most. And then, just figuring out what's taking your time, and you may be wasting it on social media or so, because I know I'm guilty of that every now and then. But you can use that instead to dedicate to things you find important. So some tools for this ideation stage is, of course, pencil and paper, which we already utilized. You can use a whiteboard to do a similar exercise, tablet and a tablet pen, same thing there. And then you can also start using some flowchart makers. I know draw.io and miro.com, those are some free tools that you can use to start connecting the dots on some of those. Okay, step number 2 is the requirement stage. If you're at this step, it means you wrote down what's important to you, you categorized it, maybe you started breaking it down, but now it's time to start fleshing it out a bit more. So at this step, you want to start analyzing your goals individually. So from the 3 to 5 important goals that you picked, maybe it's time to just narrow down and focus on one of them. So go ahead and look at that list of goals that you wrote down. Maybe just pick one of them for now and try to choose something that's more of a long-term, maybe 1 to 6 month goal. And we want to start thinking about this goal as a result of some magic black box, at least for this requirement stage. We often do this in software engineering just to determine what a specific component or function should do. You provide some inputs and it produces an output. So tip number 1 for the requirement stage is thinking of your goals as a result of something via the black box method. You don't need to understand all the internal workings and of that black box. You just want to understand what are the inputs and what are the outputs. So let's go through an example here. Let's say our output is to run a 5K. That means you have the output there is run a 5K. And you also want to start determining what else does that include. Is the 5K include some obstacles? Is there a certain time that we want to meet when we're doing this? And the more well-defined this is, the more we know what the input should be. So some of the inputs for that running 5K could be, going for a 10 to 20 minute walk. If there's obstacles, maybe you want to start doing some, body resistant workouts. Maybe you're doing it in a group, so you can, get the group together to do some running or exercises together. And so you can go ahead at this point and, for your specific goal, you can start thinking through what are the inputs that you need to do in order to reach your specific goal. Tip number 2 here is determine who the stakeholders are. If your goal involves others, such as, spending more time with family, it's generally a good idea to see, get their feedback and see what they think, would be the best way to spend more quality time in that case. Even if you're the only stakeholder for that goal, Be sure to stay critical about your own goal and try to view things without your own personal bias. But even having somebody who cares about you and has your best interest in mind, getting their feedback would be considered a stakeholder for this stage. So some questions to consider here is how will you measure success? How does this affect others? How much time am I willing to commit to this? Is it challenging me? Does it bring me fulfillment? And throughout all this, you want to continue to scrutinize your goals and be sure to vet if it's still a good idea to pursue. Some tools for this stage are, of course, paper and pencil still. I recommend starting getting a notes app going, something digital that you can refer to pretty quickly. Maybe it's a documents application, so Word, Pages, Google Docs, Notion, to start categorizing these ideas. And then if you need to communicate with others about, thinking about things, getting their inputs, that's also a good tool to have. Step 3 is prototyping. This is where we'll mostly be focusing on researching our goals and experimenting with different methods. So you figured out what your goal is, you thought through some of the inputs and outputs, maybe you got some initial feedback. Now it's time to start prototyping and experimenting with our approach. So in this stage, it's really about discovering the process of achieving our goal. And we're going to go into the weeds of our black box analogy in the last step and figure out how to actually make it happen. It's similar to digging into the source code and documentation of our software projects. And this step really only makes sense if your goal is more medium to long term. So I recommend that, if you're going to go through this prototyping stage, do it for a long-term goal. So let's look at some of the benefits of prototyping in the manufacturing industry and seeing, how can we relate that over to our own goals. So early discovery to design problems, in our case, is did we miss any requirements when fleshing out our goal? Estimate production costs, manufacturing time, and requirements for material. Did we underestimate the amount of time or cost that this goal would take? Determine the machinery necessary for production. Did we prepare ourselves with the right tools to meet this goal? Testing to determine fit and durability. Did the process work for me? Receive feedback from clients and end users. Did I get feedback from those who this goal affects? And then finally, determine final function and design. Did I learn, what did I learn to help me continue pursuing this goal? So prototyping is a great way for us to dip our toes in the water and get a feel of what it takes to accomplish that goal. So tip number 1 for the prototyping phase is research and discover how others have reached that goal. In the web development world, there's a ton of frameworks and libraries that help us meet our business requirements. They lay good foundations for us to build off of. So just like boiler templates and open source projects, we can learn a ton from just seeing how others have tackled a similar problem. So for example, let's say your professional goal is how to be an engineering manager. There's a ton of resources out there from videos, podcasts, blogs, and people sharing their journey and experience that you could learn from. So the prototyping phase would include, maybe reaching out to other professionals who have met a similar career goal that you have, maybe buy them some lunch and understand, how they got to where they are. And this is just really, you're trying to figure out if there's already been a path set for you and if you can follow that path. So just be sure to do your research here. Tip number 2 is perfect is the enemy of good. So this phrase isn't about, reaching perfection. It's about making progress in the right direction. So a lot of the time we hear that quality is better than quantity. Well, in the prototyping phase of our goal, we want to completely throw that out the window, at least for this case. So there's a great story from a pottery teacher that illustrates this point, that quality isn't always superior to quantity. So in his intro to making bases class, the pottery teacher divided his students into 2 groups. The first group was the quantity group, whose grade was dependent on submitting 100 pottery bases by the end of the year. Now, the second group was the quality group. Their grade was dependent on the excellent quality of their vase. They only needed to produce 1 vase, but it needed to be nearly perfect. So at the end of the year, the vases were, the best vases were produced by the quantity group, since they spend a majority of their time experimenting with different materials, strategies, skills, and they learn from their mistakes. While the quality group was mostly focused on the same vase and they're trying to make that as perfect as possible. Now, I heard this story told in multiple ways, but it just illustrates that focusing too much on getting it done right prevents us from getting better, learning faster, and ultimately reaching our goal. Another way of saying this is sharpening the axe is not a waste of time. So spending time in this prototyping stage is not necessarily a bad thing. Of course, you eventually want to move on from the prototyping phase to actually achieving whatever goal that is. But trying to figure out which processes are best for you is always a good spend of time. And then some wise words from a psychedelic dog is sometimes sucking at something is the first step to becoming really good at something. Shout out to if you ever watched that cartoon. It's definitely a fun one. Some cool tips or nice tools for this stage, for the prototyping stage, is templates and checklists. So while you're doing your researching, trying to discover how others have done it, a lot of the times you're going to come across blogs and videos that will probably give you some type of template, maybe some checklists on how to do that. Another one is LinkedIn, connecting with others who might have already reached a goal that you're trying to achieve. So you can connect with them, maybe ask them a few questions if they're so kind. And then podcasts, YouTube, or online courses. Those are really helpful if you're trying to achieve more of a maybe a technical goal where you need actually some foundational knowledge in order to achieve that goal. And then lastly is reviewing existing implementations. So for this example, I just had GitHub, where again you can review source code of how others have done a certain or particular thing. Alrighty, the planning stage. So step 4 is planning and setting action items for our goals. So as tech professionals, you already know what this stage looks like. I don't feel like there's no way you've gotten around it. You've been handed a bunch of tickets as action items, and this is where the rubber meets the road, and you have to start executing on some of that stuff. So you already selected and vetted a goal, and you further define what's required to achieve this, and you possibly experimented with different strategies. But now at this planning stage, it's time to commit. So we're going to jump right into our first step here, is just to list out all our action items if needed and group them by phases. If you're a project manager or somebody who has some experience with this, definitely leave some comments below in the chat session so that others can, maybe you have some better tips there as well as I'm going through these. So definitely feel free to contribute to maybe tips that might help with this phase as well for people who are trying to achieve their goals. So from a project management viewpoint, action items are the tasks into which a project is broken down to for delivery. They're the sum of actions that need to be taken to move a project from to do over to done. So let's take a look at an example here. So let's say your goal is to learn a guitar, learn to play the guitar. So maybe some of the action items are, of course, number 1, if you don't already have one, you need to purchase a guitar. Number 2 is learn the basic chords. 3, maybe some strumming patterns. And 4, maybe you want to approach a instructor and maybe start taking some lessons. And at this stage, you really want to start thinking about, what items have to be completed before the other. What sections can you group these items into? How long will these action items take me? How urgent is it that I do this? How important is this item to reaching my goal? Could I start blocking off some time in my calendar to work on these items? Do any of these tasks require delegation? For example, if you're planning on doing some renovations to your backyard, maybe you need to hire a professional, so that would be an example of delegating. So it's no longer really about defining your goals in this stage. It's more about defining the strategy on how you plan to achieve that goal. So tip number 2 here is getting out of your own way. So sometimes we overanalyze what is needed to start on a project or take action. And so here are some general strategies to kind of get out of your own way. So Jeff Bezos, the previous CEO of Amazon, he's accredited for the 70% rule, where he states that most decisions should probably be made where it's somewhere around 70% of the information you wish you had. If you wait for 90% in most cases, you're probably being a little bit too slow. So when it comes to creating action items, don't overthink every little thing. Have a grasp on what's needed and kind of just move on to the next thing. But you also want to be cautious of having too many options and having to make too many decisions. There's a great book that's called The Paradox of Choice, which illustrates that having too many options can lead to analysis paralysis. And I see, Vonda, you already beat me to the punchline there. So this just illustrates that, being overwhelmed by too many number of options and decisions could definitely prevent you from moving forward. But in that study, it was a subject on jams in the grocery stores. The researchers found that more people purchased jam when there was fewer options. So more specifically, they found that reducing the options of jam at the grocery store from 24 options to 6 options increased the number of shoppers' willingness to buy jam from 3% over to 30%. So avoid just having too many pathways or options during this planning stages, and just try to narrow down what is needed, and again, just kind of move on from there. So when planning out our action items, another lesson from good old Jeff Bezos is determining how reversible and consequential our decisions are. So an example of this is if you're pouring your life savings into something risky, then it's pretty big and consequential decision. And that's probably going to take some time for you to sit down, think about, evaluate whether it's a good decision. But if it's something like choosing the color of an accent wall, that's pretty reversible and inconsequential. At least I would think so. So you can easily redo that wall on a weekend if needed. But that's just to illustrate the differences between the two. So tip number 3 here is to start a spreadsheet. Start adding those items to a spreadsheet or notes where you can start tracking them and adding the state of the action item. So some of those states might be, to do, doing, and done. Those are kind of the classic there. Of course, you can break those down even further, but we want to write down our task in our notes somewhere where you can review frequently. And if you're stuck, you can just always kind of figure out what the goal is or what the plan is and just kind of work backwards from there. So another phrase here that I'm not a big fan of is don't have a backup plan. I think that's pretty bad advice, especially during this planning stages. It's okay to have backup plans, especially if you're like in a professional setting. You're kind of you should have backup plans there. So you would kind of say something, if this doesn't work out, then I am going to do X, Y, Z instead. But my personal view is if the probability is low and the urgency is high for that specific task, then you should have a backup plan. If the probability that you'll complete that action item is pretty high, then maybe you don't need to completely flesh something out or even plan something. And then at this stage, also don't forget to plan for spaces and time to just focus and relax. Although these steps are kind of modeled after how we work through technical projects, we have to remember that, this is our lives that we're planning out. We don't want to be endlessly completing task after task after task and just figuring out what's next. Also, include some time to relax there and just take a breather. So some tools here for the planning stage is the notes application. That's, again, one of my favorite ones, so you'll probably see that one come up here a lot. You can start introducing some task tracking apps. So a lot of us are familiar with this for technical projects. So you might use Wrike, Trello, Notion. I think Asana is another, and there's definitely endless there. I feel like there's a new task tracking app coming up every other day. So also calendar apps, that's going to be necessary for actually putting this in a time slot. And, so we're making sure we're prioritizing that. You can also start introducing some spreadsheets here. especially if your task is starting to grow a lot more. Maybe you want to add some more attributes to it that some of those other apps can't clearly capture. But if you know any other apps for this stage, definitely leave them in the chat so that others, can also learn from maybe some tools that you use during this stage. All right, step 5 out of 7 is the execution stage. And I put a little slide here to take for us to take a breather and just a little pause. I also wanted to do a time check to see how we're doing here. And I think I might just keep going through the rest of them here. That way I'm not, trying to get everything out too fast. But I'm going to take a little breather for myself as well. All right. So we covered a lot here, but funny enough, this execution stage, this is the most straightforward kind of phase. It's really, we already planned everything out. We already thought everything out. We don't need to use so much processing power of our brains anymore. It's just to execute on what the plan is. Well, I'll go into detail a little further later on, not to be so mindless on this stage, but we do have the task. We can just pick them up and start completing them as we go. But we have the goal. We scoped out the work. Now it's just time to start executing. So tip number 1 here is the snowball method. And the snowball method is just saying, we want to tackle the easiest thing first. So the easiest to more complex, because we want to gain more momentum as we knock out each remaining item. So by attacking the easier thing first, it might not be the most important. A lot of people try to balance here with doing what's the most important first, but I would argue in some cases it's better to attack the thing that's easier first, especially if you haven't built that momentum yet, because it gets some dopamine going. You get excited about tackling the next thing because you already completed the first thing. So once you have a good momentum going, then at that phase, then I would start advising, okay, maybe start tackling the tough thing first and do it first thing in the morning. Because throughout the day, we all get fatigued by all the decisions and actions we have to take. So that towards the end of the day, we definitely, we start to feel like, oh man, what a long day it was. I don't want to pick up any more things. I don't want to think about anything else. So we want to try to do what's the most urgent and important things right in the morning before that decision fatigue hits. And then once that momentum is rolling, you really want to make and put your efforts towards addressing any impediments and blockers right away. So our buddy here, Isaac Newton, his first law of motion states that a body in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted by an outside force. So some impediments and blockers include things that kind of waste our time, like social media apps. Maybe it's too much Netflix or Facebook. My new favorite recently is TikTok. It's if you haven't downloaded it and you're trying to, stay focused, I recommend staying away from TikTok. It's pretty addicting. You don't really have to totally remove all these things from your life. Just put this here just to make sure you monitor them, make sure they're not blocking you from achieving the next thing. You definitely should, again, plan some time for leisurely activities. Another helpful step here is write a daily highlight. So something that you want to accomplish that day, and just let it be one thing. I know we have a list of 100 things to do, but pick one thing out of there. Say, if I get this one thing done, I'll be pretty happy. Another item that helped me through the grind of kind of the execution stage is to write something that I'm grateful for. Right next to my daily highlight, I write, this is the one thing I want to do today, and this is the one thing that I'm thankful for. I think it's really imperative for us to remind ourselves that it's a privilege to be focused on our goals and working towards them. Although we should continue challenging ourselves, but if we're becoming unhappy and unpleasant to be around, I think it might be time to refocus. And we'll be talking about that in the last 2 steps here. So sometimes while executing on these action items, we'll be exploring the unknown, and you'll have to learn to kind of be in an uncomfortable situation. Don't be afraid to reach out for help. It's helpful to find others who are on the same journey, or at least who care about your well-being. and reach out to them if you're ever, feeling that that fatigue or that grind of, completing all these tasks. Some tools for the execution step is Post-it notes, 4x6 cards. Those are my favorite for a daily thing to do. You can also use reminder apps, time tracking apps to make sure you're spending the time in the right place. And I'm a big fan of app blockers as well. So setting time limits on certain apps and making sure that it gets blocked off from your phone and your laptop at certain times. All right, step number 6 is the monitor and manage stage. So in the project management world, you often see the execution and monitoring control stack on top of each other. That's because this step is activated at the same time we start the execution step. So this phase is about measuring our performance, tackling our action items against the plan that we had set for ourselves. So Peter Drucker, he's a widely known management theorist. He's attributed to saying what gets measured gets managed. I like to just reverse that a bit and say what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. So you have to measure your performance on completing the set action items to ensure that progress is being made here. So in this phase, you want to track yourself and you want to be real with yourself. The monitoring management phase is meant to calibrate and check in. This is where it kind of differs a bit from project management and technical development. Often in our professional lives, we're tasked with figuring out what's wrong, figuring out the right path ahead, and kind of pushing the ship in the right direction and just going full steam ahead. But when it comes to our personal goals, I believe this stage should be about finding a good balance. Of course, we all want to hit our goals and close out action items. But even though we worked up to create these checkpoints and see how we're making progress, these steps are meant for us to, get ourselves going in the right direction. So tip number 1 here, and it's the only tip for this stage, is just to be kind to yourself while trying to reach your passion and goals. So some of the things we want to monitor in this phase is, are you enjoying the journey? Are you making sure you're spending time away from the screen? Is this bringing me joy in some way or another? How can I optimize this process for long-term happiness? And remember, it's about enjoying the journey. Designing these systems is just to give us a framework of what's needed. You can also, experiment with different tracking methods. I like to switch between paper to digital, back and forth. As I mentioned, I like Post-it notes and index cards. You can do digital notes. You can use more complex task tracking apps. But just ensure that's something that you review daily. Yeah, we made it. We did it to the final step. Step 7, the wrap-up phase. This is really the celebratory part of our goal setting. It's often the step that we overlook and we brush it off in order to move on to the next thing. But unlike closing out a project for a technical project that we do, this differs a bit because closing a project, technically, it usually includes receiving some sign-off for the deliverables that we did. And unlike technical projects, our goals, they're not always temporary initiatives. Sometimes they're lifelong endeavors, such as living a healthy lifestyle or changing our sleeping habits. Tip number 1 for this stage is to document and reflect on the lessons learned. So Mike Tyson has a great quote that says, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Sometimes we face hiccups and setbacks in our journey to achieving our goals. That's completely normal. It should be expected by you. There's always something to learn from setbacks. So this is what we really want to capture is, if we made some mistakes, make sure we capture them so that we don't do them again. If we did something that worked for us, make sure we remember this is the path that worked for me. So in this phase, I recommend either journaling or doing a voice recording for this portion. Similar to the ideation stage, we really just want to capture our thoughts and feelings and get those down and see what we've learned. So tip number 2 is to celebrate, even if your action items and goals weren't fully completed. I'm running a bit over time here, but I'm almost wrapped up. So I find it helpful to think of this wrap-up phase as thinking of things as probabilities rather than definite. You can tell yourself, hey, this thing was super new to me. I knew there's a lot of unknowns going into it. The probability of me doing this was pretty low, but progress was made, learnings were captured, and I did enjoy that process. And then sometimes we tend to struggle to accept the quality and efforts that we put into something because it doesn't meet the expectations that we have set for ourselves. So if you're in this boat, then it's important to remember that self-improvement and self-acceptance can live together, and often should. You could continue improving yourself while at the same time accepting and being happy with who you are. So in order to celebrate, you have to let go and move on. Some lessons from the Stoics here is don't worry about things you can't change. Be careful not to choose paths that induce stress, but be sure to continue challenging yourself, be disciplined, but also be gentle and kind to yourself. And remember, it's about enjoying the journey. Designing these systems and using these systems is just to give us a framework. Hey, but okay, last note here. It's a privilege to be striving for these goals and bettering ourselves. These are the final steps here. Thank you so much. I appreciate you guys' time and efforts, and I hope you guys achieve all the goals you have set for yourself.
It's a celebration.
Hey.
Juan, great presentation. Thank you for sharing with us. I'm going to drop in the links if you guys can. It's a short survey, so if you can take some time to fill out our short survey, and then head on over to the main stage. We're going to have a graduation going on. So thank you, Juan, again for the presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and meet us on the main stage.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.